Reflections on the question of the validity of the papacy of Pope Francis. The safest guiding principle in the crucial question for the life of the Church regarding the validity of the papacy of Pope Francis should be the prevailing practice in the history of the Church, with which were resolved cases of presumably invalid papal renunciations or elections. In this prevailing practice was shown the sensus perennis ecclesiae, the perennial meaning of the Church. The principle of legality applied ad litteram to the letter, or that of juridical positivism, was not considered in the great practice and tradition of the Church an absolute principle, since the legislation of the papal election is only a human positive law and not a divine revealed law. The human law that regulates the assumption of the papal office or the dismissal from the papal office must be subordinated to the greater good of the whole Church, which in this case is the real existence of the visible head of the Church and the certainty of this existence for all the body of the Church clergy and faithful. This visible existence of the head and the certainty about it are required by the very nature of the Church. The universal Church cannot exist for a considerable time without a visible supreme shepherd, without the successor of Peter, since the vital activity of the universal Church depends on its visible head, such as, for example, the appointment of diocesan bishops and cardinals, appointments that require the existence of a valid pope. In turn, the spiritual good of the faithful depends on a valid appointment of a bishop, since in the case of an invalid episcopal appointment due to a presumably invalid pope, priests would lack pastoral jurisdiction, confession, marriage. From these also depend those dispensations that only the Roman Pontiff can grant, and also indulgences, all these for the spiritual good and eternal salvation of souls. Applying, in this case, the principle of supplying of jurisdiction would undermine the characteristic of the Church's visibility and would be substantially the position of the sede vacantist theory. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, when consecrating bishops without the Pope's mandate, also applied the principle of supplying of jurisdiction, but he applied it only to specific cases and not to the entire pontifical jurisdiction. He always mentioned the Pope in the canon of the Holy Mass. The acceptance of the possibility of a prolonged time of a vacancy of the Holy See easily leads to the spirit of sede vacantism, which ultimately constitutes a kind of a sectarian and quasi-heretical phenomenon that has appeared in the past 60 years due to the problems with Vatican II and the conciliar and post-conciliar popes. The spiritual good and eternal salvation of the faithful is the supreme law in the normative system of the Church. For this reason, there is the principle of supplet ecclesia, or sanatio in radice, healing at the root. That is, the Church completes what was against the human positive law, in the case of the sacraments, which demand jurisdictional faculties, as for example confession, marriage, confirmation, the burdens of the intentions of the Holy Masses. Guided by this truly pastoral principle, the instinct of the Church has also applied the principle of supplet ecclesia, or the sanatio in radice, in the case of doubts about a renunciation or a pontifical election. Concretely, the sanatio in radice, the healing at the root of an invalid pontifical election, was expressed in the peaceful and morally universal acceptance of the new pontiff by the episcopate and the Catholic people, for the same fact that this election, elected, presumably invalidly elected pontiff, was nominated in the canon of the Holy Mass practically by the entire Catholic clergy. The history of the Church is a sure teacher in this matter. The longest vacancy of the Apostolic See lasted 2 years and 9 months, from November 29, 1268 until September the 1st, 1271, in the time where lived St. Thomas Aquinas. It was also the time there were evidently invalid pontifical elections in other times. For example, the assumption of the papal office invalidly by Pope Gregory VI, and he became Pope by buying the papacy with a large sum of money from his predecessor, Pope Benedict IX, in the year 1045. However, the Roman Church has always considered Gregory VI as a valid pope, and even Hildebrand, who was a cardinal, who later became Pope Saint Gregory VII, he considered Gregory VI to be a legitimate pope, notwithstanding the illegitimate manner by which Gregory VI became pope. Then, another example, Pope Urban VI had been elected under enormous pressure and threats from the Roman people. Some cardinals electors feared even for their lives. Such was the atmosphere of the election of Urban VI in the year 1378. During the coronation of the new Pope Urban VI, all the cardinals electors, without exception, paid him homage and recognized him publicly as Pope during the first month of his pontificate. After a few months, however, some cardinals, especially the French cardinals, began to doubt the validity of the election because of the threatening circumstances and the moral pressure they had to suffer during the election. For this reason, these cardinals elected a new pope, who was called Clement VII, a Frenchman, who chose Avignon as his residence and became an anti-pope. He and his successors were considered by the Roman Church always as anti-popes, as all the editions of the Annuario Pontificio demonstrate. This began thus after the election of this anti-pope Clement VII began one of the most disastrous crises in the history of the Church, the so-called Great Western Schism, which lasted almost 40 years, tearing apart the unity of the Church and damaging the spiritual good of souls so much. The Roman Church has always recognized Urban VI as a valid pope, despite the probably invalidating factors of his election. The fact that even saints, as for example St. Vincent Ferrer, during a time recognized the anti-pope Clement VII as the only valid pope, is not a convincing argument, since saints are not infallible in all their opinions. The same St. Vincent Ferrer, however, later abandoned the Avignon anti-pope Clement VII and recognized the pope in Rome. Pope St. Celestine V made his renunciation in circumstances of pressure and insinuations by the powerful Cardinal Benedetto Gaetani, who succeeded him as Pope Boniface VIII in the year 1294. Because of these circumstances, a part of the faithful and clergy of that time never recognized Boniface VIII as a valid pope. They continued to consider Celestine as a valid pope, even though he abdicated already. However, the Roman Church considered Boniface VIII always as a legitimate pope because the acceptance of Boniface VIII by the overwhelming part of the episcopate and the faithful healed at the root the possible invalidating circumstances of both the renunciation of Celestine V and the election, consequently, of Boniface VIII. Monsignor Georg Genswein, the particular secretary of the former Pope Benedict XVI, he said in a declaration to LifeSite News from February the 14th, 2019, that the renunciation of Benedict XVI of the Petrine office was valid, and he stated that there is only one Pope legitimately elected, and it is Francis. End of the quote of Archbishop Georg Genswein. By then, the idea of a possible redefinition of the papal ministry had been launched. Some people say that Pope Benedict's intention was that of maintaining the papacy, assuming the office capable of bifurcating in two. But this is a substantial error, since the monarchical and unitary nature of the papacy is of divine right and cannot be divided in such a manner. God alone judges intentions, whereas canon law merely limits itself in evaluating the outward behavior. A well-known sentence of canon law affirms that de internis non judicat praetor. It means a judge does not judge interior things, thoughts, intentions. On the other hand, Canon 1526, paragraph 1 of the new Code of Canon Law points out that, quotation, the onus of providing the proofs falls to the one alleging. Onus probandi incumbit eiqui asserit. There is a difference between a clue and a proof. Therefore, we have to be very careful here. Then, furthermore, if Pope Benedict is the legitimate Pope, what would happen if, from one day to the next, he should die, or instead, before he died, Pope Francis should pass away or renounce? Given the fact that many current cardinals were created by Pope Francis, and none of the cardinal electors consider him as an anti-pope, the apostolic succession would be interrupted at the See of Peter, jeopardizing the visibility of the Church. The paradox is that to prove the invalidity of Benedict's renunciation is a juridical sophism, and they are employed for these juridical sophisms. But then, to resolve the problem of Benedict's or Francis' succession, there would be necessary extra-canonical solutions to be used against the law. The hypothesis of Benedict XVI's invalid renunciation, and therefore of the consequently invalidity of the papacy of Francis, properly presents itself as a dead end. For 9 years, the Apostolic See would have been de facto vacant, since Benedict XVI did not make any act of government, no episcopal or cardinal appointment, no act of dispensation of indulgences, and so on. For this reason, the Universal Church would be paralyzed in its visible aspect. Such an assumption would amount, in practice, to the attitude of sedevacantism. In the past 9 years, all the appointments of apostolic nuncios, diocesan bishops and cardinals, all the pontifical dispensations, the indulgences granted and used by the faithful would be null and void, according to this theory, and with all the harm consequences for the spiritual good of souls. All the cardinals nominated by Pope Francis would be, according to this theory, invalid, that is, there are no cardinals, and this would apply to the most of the current college of cardinals. Another purely theoretical hypothesis is also that we cannot apply this as a purely hypothesis. It remains an hypothesis, which we have to carefully to examine. Therefore, we have to repeat the surest way of the great tradition of the Church. The hypothesis that says that Benedict XVI is still the only valid Pope, and therefore Pope Francis would be an invalid Pope, contradicts not only the proven and reasonable practice of the great tradition of the Church, but also simply common sense. Furthermore, in this case, one absolutizes the aspect of legality, that is, in our case, the human norms of renunciation and of pontifical election, to the detriment, to the harm of the good of souls, since there would be created a situation of uncertainty on the validity of acts of government of the Church, and this undermines the visible nature of the Church, and one approaches, therefore, the mentality of sedevacantism. The surer way, via Tutior, and the example of the constant practice and the great tradition of the Church must be followed also in our present case. The rudder of the boat of the Church holds our Lord Jesus Christ in his almighty hands, even in situations of heaviest storms, such as it can be in a time of a doctrinally ambiguous Pope. Such storms are relatively short compared to other great crises during the 2000 years of the existence of the militant Church. In the midst of the confusion and the storm within the life of the Church of our day, our Lord will rise and rebuke the winds and the sea, and there will be again given a time of calm, doctrinal security, liturgical sacredness, and holiness of the priests, bishops, and popes. We have to renew in the midst of a situation which, humanly spoken, appears helpless, our unshakable faith in the divine truth that the gates of hell will never prevail against the Catholic Church.